Nebraska, 1879. The late October sun scorched the cracked earth of Red Willow County, turning the market square of McCook into a haze of dust and sweat. Horses snorted, their hooves stirring clouds that clung to the air like a second skin. Cattle lowed in distant pens, and men's voice gruff. Whiskey-soaked bartered over prices with the urgency of a season's end. The final livestock auction of the year was dwindling, but a knot of onlookers lingered near a weathered corral where a sorrel gelding stood, ribs stark against its hide, eyes dull from neglect. Jacob Harrow, a rancher of 38, adjusted his worn Stetson against the glare, a man carved by solitude and the unyielding plains. He rarely ventured into town unless necessity drove him seed, wire, or a horse worth his coin. He'd spotted the gelding at dawn and returned now as the crowd thinned, his boots thudding against the hard-packed dirt. That's when he saw her. A young woman, no older than 20, stood just beyond the corral's splintered fence. Her hair, tangled and sun-bleached, fell across her face, half-hiding eyes that seemed to chase something invisible. Her dress, faded calico, was torn at the hem, and her bare feet were caked with dust, as if the earth itself had claimed her. She didn't speak, didn't move, her hands clasped loosely before her. Beside her stood a man, red-faced and swaying, a bottle in one hand and a frayed rope in the other. The rope wasn't tied to the gelding, it looped around her wrist, loose but deliberate. "Got a mute one here," the man bellowed, his voice slurring into the crowd. "Came from my second wife, I reckon. Don't talk, don't hear. Cleans, cooks, don't complain. Cheap as dirt." A few men laughed, low and cruel. One spat tobacco into the dust. Jacob turned his gaze back to the gelding, his jaw tight. He hadn't come for this. He wanted a horse, nothing more. But then he felt it, not a sound, not a plea, but a weight. He looked up, and her eyes met his. No desperation, no fear, just a steady, piercing clarity. As if she saw straight through the scars he carried, scars no one else had ever named. In her gaze, he glimpsed something he hadn't felt in years, recognition, or perhaps a reflection of his own unspoken loneliness. The drunk staggered closer, bottle sloshing. "You got coin? Want the horse? She comes with it. Ain't hauling her back worth less than the mud on her feet." Jacob's hand tightened on the corral rail. The gelding pawed the ground, nostrils flaring. Her eyes didn't waver. He turned to the man, voice low. "I'll take both." The laughter was instant, sharp-edged. "Harrow, you buying stock or a bride?" A voice jeered. Jacob didn't answer. He counted out coinsino for a horse. Not a sowlin dropped them into the man's trembling hand. The drunk yanked the rope, but the woman stepped back, closer to Jacob, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Yours now," the man muttered, spitting into the dirt. "Don't say I didn't warn Yasha's no good." Jacob untied the rope and tossed it aside. He led the gelding from the pen, the woman following, her steps soft but sure. She carried nothing but a thin shawl, frayed at the edges. At his wagon, she paused, waiting. He gestured to the back, and she climbed in, curling into a corner like someone accustomed to being unseen. As he took the reins, he felt a faint tug on his sleeve. Her fingers, rough and small, had grazed his coat, just once. She didn't look at him now, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but that touch carried a weight of choice, a trust she'd placed in a stranger. Jacob Harrow, who spoke more to the wind than to men, who lived alone on 300 acres of Nebraska prairie with only fences and memories for company, now had a woman who couldn't hear, yet seemed to understand more than anyone he'd ever known. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding over the rutted road. Behind him, she sat beneath a blanket, face turned to the breeze, never glancing back. Neither did he. The trail stretched through rolling hills and scattered cottonwoods, the sky vast and unyielding. Jacob's ranch wasn't grand, a low house with a tin roof, a barn, a few sheds, and endless fields where cattle roamed under a boundless sky. It was quiet, orderly, and for a man like him, it had always been enough. Until now. He helped her down from the wagon, half expecting her to run or cower, but she stepped lightly, her eyes scanning the land, not wary, just observant, as if memorizing every blade of grass. Inside, he lit the stove and pointed to a kettle. She nodded, moving with a familiarity that startled him. fetching cups and a ladle as if she'd always known where they were. Still, she made no sound. After a sparse supper of beans and cornbread, he pulled a piece of chalk from a drawer and tapped the table's edge. "Name," he said, voice rough from disuse. She studied him, then knelt by the table, writing in careful, slanted letters, "Clara." He read it aloud, testing the sound. "Clara." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and she turned away, disappearing into the shadowed barn to sleep. The next morning, Jacob found her in the barn, kneeling beside the gelding. The horse, weak from the auction, stood calmer now, its ears twitching as she ran a cloth over its flank. Her hands moved with a quiet rhythm, not words, not gestures, but a language of touch. Jacob watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He'd seen men lose fingers to less docile animals, but the gelding stood still, trusting her. Maybe she couldn't hear, but she understood more than most. He gave her tasks: scrub the porch, mend a harness, fetch water. She worked without question, her silence blending with the ranch's quiet. Each night, he left chalk by the door, and she'd write brief notes, wood low, horse limping, sky heavy. They didn't speak, but the silence wasn't hollow, it was alive, shared. Then came the storm. It began subtly, a warm wind rustling the grass at dusk. Jacob was in the barn, checking a calf, when Clara appeared, barefoot, her breath quick but silent. She grabbed his arm, pulling hard, her eyes urgent. "What?" he asked, startled. She pointed skyward, hands trembling. He glanced up. Clouds churned, distant, but closing fast. He hesitated, but her gaze held him, insistent. Then it struck. A bolt of lightning split the sky, the crack deafening. It hit a cottonwood near the barn, the tree exploding into flame. Sparks flew, and the ground shook. Jacob stumbled back, the calf bleeding in panic. Smoke curled upward. Clara stood just outside, her face lit by the fire's glow, eyes steady. She'd known, not guessed, not felt, but known before the wind shifted, before the air turned electric. Jacob approached her, voice low. "How did you?" She met his eyes, silent, certain. That night, after the fire was quenched and the animals settled, they sat at the kitchen table. No chalk, no words. Just a man and a woman, hands resting on worn wood. Jacob realized he wasn't alone, not in the way he'd been for years. Clara, who couldn't speak, had heard something beyond sound, a warning woven into the world itself. And in her silence, she'd saved him. Since the storm, Jacob watched her differently, not with doubt, but with a quiet wonder. Clara never spoke, never signed beyond her brief chalk notes. Yet she seemed to know things no one else could. One morning, a heifer stood apart, refusing to eat. Jacob noted it, planning to check later, but Clara acted first. She prepared a stall with fresh straw, mixed herbs from the garden, and stood by the cow, her hands soothing its flank. By evening, the heifer was birthing a calf. She'd known, somehow. Jacob, too, carried burdens. In town, whispers followed him, rumors about his father, a man who'd claimed land during the Homestead Act, displacing others with threats and worse. The guilt wasn't new, but it stung. He never spoke of it, yet one evening, as he sat on the porch, Clara joined him. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She placed a hand on his shoulder, light but firm. After a moment, he muttered, "How do you know I carry this?" "The shame of what my father did." Clara's eyes searched his. Then she touched his chest, over his heart. She turned and walked to the old oak marking his father's grave, a place she'd never been told about. She knew. At night, Jacob dreamed of his father's voice, harsh, unyielding, speaking of land won through blood. He woke, sweating, and saw Clara by the hearth, a candle flickering. Beside it lay his mother's locket, tucked away for years in a locked trunk. He hadn't touched it since her death. "How?" he whispered. Clara didn't answer. She rose and left, but he understood. She'd heard not words, not memories, but the weight of his guilt, the grief he buried. And in her quiet, she answered. The town began to notice. A shopkeeper's wife muttered that Clara stared too long at the livestock, as if she knew their fates. A farmer claimed she'd touched his sow, and it birthed a stillborn litter. "Ain't right," he said. No one had heard Clara speak, and the silence bred fear. At the mercantile, a woman shielded her child as Clara passed. Jacob saw her fingers tighten on her basket, her steps softer, as if trying to vanish. One day, a boy fell ill, burning with fever. The doctor was away, and Clara went to him. She knelt by his cot, hands on his chest, then his brow. She brewed a tea of sage and willow bark. By morning, the boy was eating. His mother wept, clutching Clara's hand, but later whispered, how'd she know? She didn't ask what was wrong. The fear grew louder. 3 days later, they came. 10 townsfolk, men and women, stood at Jacob's gate, holding unlit torches. The eldest, Amos Reed, stepped forward. We want her gone. She knows things she shouldn't. Jacob stood in the barn doorway, unshaven, resolute. She's mute, he said. Mute ain't deaf, Amos snapped. She feels storms before they break. She touches animals, and they die or live. It's unnatural. Clara watched from the house, her face calm, but her hands trembling. She moved to step out, but Jacob raised a hand. He faced them, boots sinking into the mud. She saved a child. A woman spat. Maybe she caused the fever. Jacob's voice stayed steady. She listens not with ears, but with her soul. I've lived 38 years, and she's the only one who's heard me pain, my shame without a word. The crowd stilled. You want to drive her out for being different? You'll have to face me. Amos hesitated, then turned. The others followed, torches unlit. That night, Clara set a pot of cider on the fire and sat beside Jacob. She didn't speak, didn't write. She touched his hand, and he curled his fingers around hers. In the silence, they listened to the fire, the night, and the bond growing between them. Winter's first chill settled over the Nebraska plains, frosting the grass and sharpening the air. Jacob Harrow's ranch stood steadfast under a gray sky, its low house and weathered barn a quiet anchor amid the rolling fields. The events of autumn, the auction, the storm, the confrontation at the gate had left a mark, not just on the land but on Jacob himself. Clara, the young woman who'd arrived silent and unknown, had become a presence he couldn't imagine absent. Her silence wasn't empty. It was a language of glances, touches, and chalk-scrawled notes that spoke louder than words ever had. Clara moved through the ranch with purpose. Her bare feet now shod in boots Jacob had bought in town. She tended the livestock with a knowing hand, calming the gelding with a brush of her palm, mixing poultices for a limping calf. Her chalk notes grew longer, more precise, fence week by creek, hens not laying, snow soon. Jacob read them each evening, marveling at how she sensed shifts in the world he only noticed after they'd passed. She didn't hear the wind, yet she knew its warnings. She didn't speak, yet her presence filled the spaces his solitude had carved. One morning, as frost glittered on the porch, Jacob watched her mend a torn blanket by the fire. Her fingers, deft and calloused, wove the needle with a rhythm that felt like a song. He handed her a mug of coffee, and their fingers brushed. She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth lifted a fleeting smile, rare and unguarded. Jacob felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He'd lived 38 years, most of them alone, and now, in this quiet woman, he found a companion who understood the weight of silence. But the town of McCook hadn't forgotten. The confrontation at the gate had scattered the torch-wielding crowd, but whispers grew in the mercantile, the church, the saloon. Clara's action saving the boy from fever. Sensing the storm were riddled with a mix of awe and suspicion. The blacksmith claimed she'd walked past his forge, and his mare foaled early. The colt weak but alive. How'd she know it was coming? He muttered. A widow swore Clara had touched her garden, and the wilted herbs bloomed again. It ain't natural, she said, though she kept the herbs. The silence Clara carried, once a curiosity, now fueled fear. She didn't speak, so the town spoke for her, weaving tales of curses and uncanny knowledge. Jacob saw it in their eyes when he rode into town for supplies. Men who'd once nodded now looked away. Women clutched their shawls tighter as he passed. He didn't speak of Clara, didn't defend her to those who wouldn't listen, but the weight of their judgment settled on his shoulders. One afternoon, at the feed store, Amos Reed, the man who'd led the crowd, cornered him. You keep that girl close, Harrow, but she's trouble. She knows things no one ought to. Jacob met his gaze, voice low. She knows what you're too scared to see. Amos snorted but stepped back, his certainty shaken. Back at the ranch, Clara seemed untouched by the town's unease. She worked as always, her hands steady, her eyes clear. One evening, as snow dusted the fields, Jacob found her in the barn, braiding straw into a small figuria horse, delicate and precise. He sat beside her, the lantern casting shadows on the wall. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "Where you came from?" She paused, her fingers still, then shook her head. She touched her chest, then his, a gesture that needed no words. "Here is enough." Jacob nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know her past, didn't need to. She was Clara, and she was here. The first test came with the blizzard. It rolled in without warning, the sky turning leaden by midday. Jacob was checking fences when the wind turned sharp, snow stinging his face. He rode back, the gelding struggling against the gale. Clara met him at the barn, her shawl whipping in the storm. She didn't wait for him to speak. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the house. Inside, she pointed to the chalkboard, "Cattle by ridge. Danger." Jacob frowned. The herd was scattered, but the ridge was a mile off, too far to check in this weather. "How do you know?" he asked. She touched her chest, then the floor, as if feeling the earth itself. Her eyes were certain. He trusted her. Bundling in his coat, he saddled the gelding and rode out, Clara following on foot despite his protests. The storm howled, visibility near zero, but she led the way, her steps sure. At the ridge, they found 6 steers huddled against a gully, half buried in snow. A 7th lay dead, frozen. Jacob roped the living ones, shouting over the wind, while Clara guided them back, her hands steady on their flanks. By the time they reached the barn, night had fallen, and Jacob's fingers were numb. Clara stoked the fire, her face flushed but calm. She'd known again, she'd known. That night, as the storm raged, Jacob sat across from her at the table. He took a piece of paper and wrote, slowly, "You feel the world in ways I can't." "How?" Clara read the words, her fingers tracing the ink. She didn't write back. Instead, she touched his hand, then her heart, her eyes holding his. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Jacob felt a shift, a door opening between them. He wasn't just a rancher anymore, and she wasn't just a stranger. They were something more, bound by a silence that spoke. But the town's fear grew louder. A rancher's barn caught fire, and though Clara was miles away, whispers blamed her. "She looked at my land last week," the man said. A child's cough lingered, and a mother claimed Clara had passed her in the street. "She's cursed," the woman hissed. Jacob heard it all, each word a stone added to the weight he carried. He didn't tell Clara, but she knew. Her steps grew quieter, her eyes more watchful. She stopped going to town, staying within the ranch's borders, but the whispers followed. One morning, a girl appeared at the gate, no older than 10, her face streaked with tears. Her brother, she said, was trapped in a well on their farm, the rope broken. The men were in the fields, the doctor gone. Jacob grabbed his gear, but Clara was already moving, a coil of rope in her hands. They followed the girl, Clara leading despite never having been to the farm. At the well, she knelt, pressing her hands to the ground, then pointed to a spot. Jacob lowered the rope, and within minutes, they pulled the boy up, shivering but alive. The girl's mother wept, clutching Clara's hands, but her gratitude was laced with fear. "How'd you know where he was?" she whispered. Clara didn't answer, her eyes on the boy. The story spread, twisted with each telling. By week's end, the preacher mentioned Clara in his sermon, not by name but as a shadow of doubt among them. "God speaks through signs," he said, "but so does the devil." Jacob sat in the back pew, his jaw tight. He didn't believe in curses, but he believed in Clara. Still, the town's fear was a tide, rising fast. The second test came with the fever. It swept through McCook like wildfire, felling children and elders alike. The doctor, overwhelmed, couldn't keep up. Jacob and Clara stayed clear, but one evening, a man rode to the ranch hat in hand. His daughter was burning, he said, and no one could help. "They say your girl knows things," he pleaded. Jacob hesitated, but Clara was already gathering herbs, yarrow, elderflower, mint. She followed the man, Jacob at her side. At the house, the girl lay on a cot, her breath shallow. Clara knelt, her hands gentle on the child's brow, then her chest. She brewed a tea, guiding the mother to spoon it slowly. By dawn, the fever broke, and the girl opened her eyes. The father fell to his knees, thanking Clara, but his wife stood back, eyes narrow. She didn't ask what was wrong, she said later, at the well. How'd she know? The question echoed, feeding the town's unease. Clara's acts of kindness became her burden. Each healing, each instinct, added to the whispers. Jacob saw it and heard the way her shoulders tensed, the way her chalk notes grew shorter, firewood low, wind sharp. She was pulling inward, shielding herself from a world that refused to understand. One night, as they sat by the fire, Jacob took her hand. "You don't have to hide," he said. She looked at him, eyes wet, and touched his chest, then hers. "I'm not hiding," the gesture said. "I'm here." But the town wouldn't relent. One evening, as snow fell, a group gathered at the saloon, their voices loud with liquor and fear. "She's a witch," a farmer said, slamming his glass. "Saved my cow, but my fence burned the next day." Another claimed she'd walked past his field, and his wheat wilted. Amos Reed, ever the leader, nodded. "Harrow's blind. She's got him fooled." The talk turned to action torches, a march, a demand for her to leave. Jacob heard of it the next day, from a boy delivering feed. He didn't tell Clara, but she knew. That afternoon, she stood by the corral, her hands on the gelding's neck, her eyes distant. Jacob joined her, his voice low. "They're scared of what they don't understand." She nodded, but her fingers trembled. That night, she wrote on the chalkboard, "Storm coming." Not sky. Jacob read it, his chest tight. She wasn't talking about weather. The climax came on a bitter January night. The wind howled, carrying the sound of boots on the frozen ground. Jacob was in the barn when Clara appeared, her face pale, her hands signing fast. "They're here." He stepped outside, and there they were, 15 townsfolk, torches lit this time, their faces hard. Amos Reed stood at the front, his voice sharp. "We warned you, Harrow. She's a danger. We want her gone tonight." Jacob stood tall, his shadow long in the torchlight. "She's done nothing but help you." A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. "She saved my son, but she knew too much. It's not right." Another shouted. "My barn burned after she passed by." The accusations piled, each one a spark in the cold air. Clara stood behind Jacob, her hands clasped, her face calm but her eyes alive with something new, not fear, but resolve. She stepped forward, and the crowd stilled. She didn't speak, didn't sign. She simply looked at them, her gaze steady, piercing. Jacob spoke, his voice low but unyielding. "You call her cursed, but she's saved your children, your livestock, your homes. She hears what you're too blind to see: pain, the fear, the truth you bury. I've lived alone most my life, and she's the only one who's heard me grief. My shame without a word. You want her gone? You'll have to burn this ranch to the ground, with me in it." The crowd faltered. A man lowered his torch. A woman turned away, her face softening. Amos opened his mouth, then closed it. Slowly, the group dispersed, their torches flickering out in the snow. Clara touched Jacob's arm, her fingers light but firm. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Inside, by the fire, she sat beside him, her hand resting on his. The silence wasn't heavy, it was home. The next morning, Clara wrote on the chalkboard, "Today will be still." And it was. The town's anger had broken, not with violence, but with doubt. A few came to the ranch over the following days, a farmer with a lame horse, a widow with a cough. Clara helped them, her hands steady, her eyes clear. The whispers didn't vanish, but they softened, tinged with curiosity instead of fear. One evening, as the snow melted and the first green peeked through the soil, Jacob found Clara by the creek, weaving a basket from willow branches. He sat beside her, the water murmuring. "You changed this place," he said. She looked at him, then touched his chest, her fingers lingering. She wrote in the dirt with a stick, "We changed it." Jacob smiled, a rare, unguarded thing. He took her hand, and they sat there, the world quiet but alive around them. But the story wasn't over. The town's fear had ebbed, but fear, like a weed, has deep roots. And Clara's gift, her ability to hear beyond sound, would face one final test, one that would bind her and Jacob not just to each other, but to the land and its people, forever. Spring crept into Red Willow County, Nebraska, in 1880, softening the plains with bursts of green and the faint hum of life returning. Jacob Harrow's ranch stood as it always had, modest, enduring, a quiet haven amid the vast prairie. The winter had been long, marked by storms both natural and human. But Jacob and Clara had weathered them together. Their bond, forged in silence and strengthened through trials, had become the heartbeat of the ranch. Clara's presence, her unspoken wisdom, her ability to hear beyond sound had transformed not just Jacob's world, but the land itself. Yet, the town of McCook remained a shadow at the edges, its whispers quieter but never silent. Clara moved through her days with a steady grace, her hands as fluent with a pitchfork as they were with a needle. She'd learned to ride the gelding, her body swaying with its rhythm as if she'd been born to it. Jacob taught her to mend fences, and she taught him to notice the small things, the way a sparrow's flight could signal rain, the way a cow's stance could warn of illness. Their evenings were spent by the fire, sharing coffee and silence, her chalkboard notes a bridge between their worlds. Calves strong, creek rising, tomorrow warm. Jacob read them aloud, her words a ritual that grounded him. But the town's unease lingered. The second confrontation, with its lit torches and accusations, had dispersed without violence. But fear was a stubborn rout. Clara's act, saving a boy from a well, breaking a child's fever, were riddled with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. Some called her a healer, others a witch. The preacher's sermons no longer named her, but his warnings about unnatural signs hung heavy. Jacob saw it in the glances at the mercantile, the way hands tightened on reins when he mentioned Clara. He didn't defend her to those who wouldn't hear, but each slight added to the weight he carried. One morning, as apple blossoms scented the air, Clara stood by the corral, her hands on the gelding's neck. Jacob joined her, his boots sinking into the soft earth. "They're still talking," he said, voice low. She nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "She wrote in the dirt. Let them talk. We are here." Jacob took her hand, his fingers curling around hers. Her certainty steadied him, but he knew the town's fear could flare again, given a spark. The spark came with the flood. It began with days of rain, steady at first, then torrential. The creek swelled, its banks crumbling, and by the third day, fields were swamps, livestock stranded. Jacob and Clara worked tirelessly, moving cattle to higher ground, reinforcing the barn. Clara's instincts guided them. She pointed to a rise where the herd would be safe, her hands sure. But in town, the flood brought chaos. Homes along the creek collapsed, and families fled to the church. Whispers turned to shouts. The rain was a curse, and Clara, with her uncanny knowledge, was its cause. Jacob heard it from a rancher seeking hay. "They say she knew the creek would rise," the man said. "Knew before the clouds even gathered." "Ain't right." Jacob's jaw tightened. "She saved my herd. You'd do well to thank her." The man looked away, unconvinced. That evening, Clara wrote on the chalkboard, "Town hurts. Water not done." Jacob read it, his chest tight. She wasn't just predicting, she was feeling the town's pain, its fear, its blame. The first test came when a woman arrived at the ranch, soaked and trembling. Her son, she said, had been swept away while trying to save their chickens. The men were searching downstream, but the current was fierce. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a rope and a lantern, her eyes sharp. Jacob followed, his heart pounding. They rode to the creek, now a roaring beast, its waters muddy and wild. Clara knelt, pressing her hands to the ground, her face tilted to the rain. She pointed upstream, against the current's pull. Jacob frowned. Upstream. He'd be downstream. Clara shook her head, her hands signing. "He's there." They fought through the rain, Clara leading, her steps sure despite the mud. At a bend, hidden by willows, they found him, a boy no older than 8, clinging to a root, his face pale. Jacob roped him, pulling him to safety, while Clara wrapped him in her shawl. The mother wept, clutching Clara, but her eyes held a flicker of fear. "How'd you know?" she whispered. Clara didn't answer, her focus on the boy. The story spread, and though the town praised her, the question lingered. How? Clara's gift, once a quiet marvel, was now a public spectacle. Families sought her out, a broken arm, a sick cow, a lost dog. She helped where she could, her hands gentle, her herbs effective. but each act fueled the divide. Some left baskets of bread at the gate, others spat as she passed. Jacob saw the toll. It took her steps slower, her chalk notes briefer, tired. Wind soft. One night, he found her by the fire, her hands idle. He knelt beside her. "You don't have to carry their fear," he said. She touched his face, her fingers tracing his jaw, and smiled a small, weary thing. "I carry what I must," her eyes said. The second test came with the fire. It started in the saloon, a lantern tipped in a drunken brawl. By midnight, half the town was ablaze, the wind carrying embers to homes and barns. Jacob and Clara saw the glow from the ranch, the sky bleeding red. Without a word, Clara saddled the gelding, her face set. Jacob grabbed buckets and followed. In town, chaos reigned. Men shouted, women carried children, horses screamed. Clara moved through it like a shadow, her hands guiding people to safety. She pointed to a barn where a family was trapped, her instincts unerring. Jacob broke the door, and they escaped, coughing but alive. As the fire died, the town took stock. Losses were heavy, but Clara's actions had saved lives. Yet, at dawn, a group gathered in the churchyard, their voices sharp. "She was there too quick," a man said. "Knew where to go before we did." Amos Reed, his face grim, nodded. "She's tied to this flood, fire, all of it." Jacob overheard, his fists clenched. He found Clara by the creek, washing soot from her hands. "They're blaming you," he said. She nodded, unsurprised, and wrote in the mud, "Fear blinds. We stay." But the final test was coming, and it would demand everything. One Sunday, as the town rebuilt, a girl vanished. She was 9, last seen picking flowers near the creek. The flood had left the land treacherous, and panic spread. Men searched with dogs, mothers wept, and the preacher called for prayers. Jacob and Clara heard at dusk, the news carried by a boy on horseback. Clara was already moving, her shawl tight around her shoulders. Jacob grabbed his coat, his heart heavy. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning. They joined the search, Clara leading despite the crowd's murmurs. She knelt, pressing her hands to the earth, her face still. The men watched, some with hope, others with suspicion. She stood, pointing to a ravine, its edges hidden by brush. "There," she signed, her hands firm. Jacob nodded, trusting her. The men hesitated, but followed. Through mud and thorns, Clara moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the ground. At the ravine's edge, they found her girl, curled in a hollow, her ankle twisted but alive. Clara knelt, brushing hair from her face, while Jacob lifted her gently. The crowd erupted in relief, but Amos Reed stepped forward, his voice cutting through. "How'd she know?" Again how, the question hung, heavy with accusation. A woman shouted, "She's cursed us all." Others murmured agreement, their gratitude turning to fear. Jacob faced them, his voice steady but fierce. "She found your child, saved her. You call that a curse?" Clara touched his arm, her eyes calm. She stepped forward, facing the crowd, and for the first time, she spoke not with her voice, but with her hands, signing slowly, deliberately. Jacob translated, his voice raw. "She says she hears the world not with ears, but with her heart. The earth, the wind, the pain you carry. She doesn't curse. She listens." The crowd stilled, some faces softening, others hard. Clara signed again, and Jacob spoke. "She stays. Not for you, but for this land, for those who hear her back." A man lowered his gaze. A woman wiped her eyes. Amos turned away, silent. That night, the ranch was quiet. Clara sat by the fire, her hands folded. Jacob took a paper and wrote, "You are my home." She read it, her eyes wet, and touched his chest, then hers. She wrote beneath his words, "And you are mine." They sat, hands entwined, the silence a vow. Years passed, the ranch weathering seasons and time. Clara's hair silvered, Jacob's steps slowed, but their bond deepened. A language of glances and touches. The town changed, slowly. Children Clara had saved grew up, telling her story not as a curse, but as a gift. They came to the ranch, learning from her how to calm a horse, how to feel a storm's approach. She taught them to listen, not with ears but with their whole being. Jacob built a bench under a cottonwood, where they sat each evening, watching the sun sink. He played a tin whistle, and Clara swayed, feeling the notes through the air. One evening, as stars emerged, Clara spoke, her voice soft, unused but clear. "I don't need sound. Only you." Jacob's throat tightened. "I hear you," he said. "Always have." They stayed there, the world quiet but full. Clara's chalkboard carried a daily ritual. "Today will be kind." "I feel it." Most days, she was right. The final moment came in winter, years later. A boy was lost in a snowstorm, and Clara, now frail, knelt in the snow, her hands on the ground. She pointed west, and Jacob, gray but steady, followed. They found the boy, safe under a pine. The town didn't question her again. They called her what she was, the woman who hears with her heart. At the ranch's end, Jacob and Clara walked the pasture, the sky amber and wide. She laughed, a soft ripple, and he kissed her forehead. Their story wasn't shouted, it was lived, a love that needed no voice. Only souls brave enough to listen. The land remembered them, and so did the people, not as a tale but as a truth, carried in the wind that whispered their names. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you make of the town's fear and the violence it nearly sparked? How do you view Clara's gift in the face of injustice and prejudice? Share your stance whether you see her as a healer or something else. And let's discuss the deeper questions of trust, difference, and the human heart. Your voice matters, and it keeps this story alive.